I welcome you to today's ECD Star introductory colloquium on the science topics of the workshop Saturation and Diffraction at the LHC and the future EIC. This workshop was planned for 2020, but has been deferred to 2021 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it will focus on the structure of the proton as measured in present and future colliders. As you know, the intention of this colloquium series is to introduce and publicize the science case of the workshop to a wider audience. Today's presentation will be given by Christophe Royon from the University of Kansas. Let me briefly introduce the speaker. After studying physics at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, he received his PhD from the University of Orsay in 1994 with highest distinction. From 1994 to 2007, he was a research associate in Saclay, and from 2007 to 2015, became a research director there. In 2016, he moved to the University of Kansas, where he is a Foundation Distinguished Professor at the moment. He has been the co-convener of several large collaborations at Fermilab and at the LHC. For his outstanding work, he has received several awards and prizes. Christophe, thanks for agreeing to give this talk.
So today I would like to present something about a journey to understand the proton at the Large Hadron Collider. And before I start, I would like to thank the Trento ECT people for this colloquium, and also for accepting our meeting that will be dedicated to forward physics at the LHC and the EIC and the diffraction. That will take place in beginning of July 2021. As you know, it was moved from 2020 because of this COVID-19 situation. So let me move to the second slide, where I discuss a bit the contents of the talk. So I will introduce briefly what is the Large Hadron Collider for people who are not familiar with it. I will discuss in a very simple way to start, especially for students, what do we get as a better understanding of the proton structure in terms of quarks and gluon. I will then move to discuss very strange events between quotes that we call diffractive and photon exchange events, and how we can detect them by measuring intact proton in the final state at the LHC. I will then move on beyond standard model physics and discuss extra dimension and axion-like particles that we can try to detect using photon exchange events. And I will finish by discussing something which is more experimental, related to the fast timing detectors. So on the next slide, I just want to introduce something that probably everybody knows, a short reminder, is what is a proton and how do we see the proton at the Large Hadron Collider? Everybody knows that the protons are constituent of nuclei. They are small. The size is about 1 Fermi or 10 to minus 15 meters, or about 1/1000 of the size of a nitrogen atom. So probably the people, when we discuss about the proton, like people in the street, they will think about 2 U quark and a down quark. And in fact, it's not the vision that I have of the proton. The vision that I would have as an LHC physicist will be more the bottom one, where you still see this 2 up quark and this down quark in blue, red, and green. But you see that the structure is much more complicated. There are these small disks, green and purple, that correspond to what we call Q and Q bar, so quark and antiquark from the C, and these kind of strings that correspond to the gluon. So in fact, the vision of the proton to be only 3 valence quark is not the true one at the LHC, as we will see in the following. So before we go to the detail on the proton structure, let me discuss why do we need accelerators in order to understand the particle structure. is basically, there was a long history that people wanted to understand what is the smaller, at the small scale and not visible by human eyes. And people started to study, biology, for instance, study cells, and they needed a microscope. And typically, you get 500 per inch, or let's say centimeter squared. Then, more recently, people discover DNA, again in biology. And for this, they need an electron microscope, about 10 million per inch. And you see, we are talking about nanometers as a typical size. Then in history, people discovered nuclei, where you have, as I said, the size of the order of Fermi, so 10 to minus 15 meters. And we need 1 million times to see 1 million times smaller object than before, than for the DNA. Or even if you want to do high energy physics, you want to be, or nuclear physics, you want to be sensitive to quark and gluons. And for this, you need, again, to gain about 3 orders of magnitude. And we have about 100 million billion per inch. And for this, if you want to see the structure of matter, the only way is to destroy this matter, for instance, destroy the protons. And for this, we send particles against particles, we smash them in accelerators. So that's why basically accelerators were developed in order to understand the structure of matter. And this comes from a very long history. In fact, even, at the time of the Greek people, so close to year 0, so 2000 years ago, people were already discuss atoms. Atom is a Greek word. It means that's something that you cannot cut. So it means from the Greek concept, this was the smallest object in nature. There was nothing smaller. And in fact, we needed to wait a very long time in order to understand that it was wrong. And indeed, atoms have some structure. The discovery of the nucleus, which is about 10 to minus 12 centimeters, came in the 1910s. So it took almost 2000 years to reach this idea that the atoms have indeed a structure. So now, concerning in the 1940s, people understood that there were other elementary objects, and there was the electron, for instance, and also protons and neutrons, that they were substructure of the nucleus. And then until the 1970s, it took again about 30 years to discover that the protons and neutrons were themselves made of quarks. So they had some substructures. The electron is still considered today to be an elementary object. So now one of the questions we will raise also during this talk, did the LHC, like the first data, 2010, 2012, or the data until now, until 2020, did we get some new insight about possible substructure of the quark or the electrons? So for this, we use the Large Hadron Collider that, I guess almost everybody heard about it. It's a very known, of course, which is located at CERN at the border between France and Switzerland. And it collides proton-proton with now a 13 TeV center of mass energy. And also it can collide a heavy ion, that we'll discuss it in the following. So you have a kind of a view of this border between Switzerland and France with the 4 main experiments. You have LHCb, ATLAS, ALICE, and the CMS. And just to give you an idea, so this is the city where I'm living now, Lawrence, in the US, in Kansas. And this would be the size around the city. It would cover half of the city if the LHC was in that small city. And just to give you an idea, so the circumference is about 27 kilometers. It sits underground, so about 50 to 100 meters below the sea level. The energy per beam is of the order of 800 megajoule. And just to remind you that 1 megajoule melts about 2 kilograms of copper. It means a huge energy. And the power consumption is about 120 megawatts. And let's say a medium-sized city, like for instance Geneva, Ann Arbor, it's about 190 megawatts in 2008. So basically the power consumption for the accelerator is the one of a small city. So what are the LHC components? It's always the same for any accelerators you have in the world. Of course, you need to accelerate the beam. This is the first idea because you need to smash the particles. And for this, you have the right plot, which is here, which shows the radio frequency cavity, which allows to accelerate the beam. And once you accelerate the beam, since we have about a circle, you need to keep them in circular orbit. And for this, we use magnets. So first of all, the dipole magnets, we keep the beam in circular orbit, so have a view of the tunnel concerning these magnets. Quadrupole magnets, which allow to focus the beam, especially when you want the beam to collide, you need them to be well focused. And also, in addition to quadrupole, you have sextupole, octupole, so it's a complicated machine that was built at the LHC. So now, let me give you just one feeling. Why do we want to use the LHC? And the idea is to go back in time. So this is where we stand today. This is the universe about 14 billion years ago when it was built. And we want to rebuild the conditions that were as close as possible at the one when the universe was created, so close to the Big Bang. So this is the kind of timescale that we are talking about. You see here, it's about 1 microsecond, which is here, when the protons formed. And you see these two arrows which are there, which shows what this was the conditions that we want to reproduce about, let's say, 10 to minus 30 or 10 to minus 20 seconds after the Big Bang for the PP collisions and also the heavy ion collision. So this is this kind of ideas, with the idea that in that case we will understand deeply the physics of elementary particles and also the elementary structure of matter that was existing basically also at this kind of energy. And for this, it's always the same. We use a detector. A detector in particle physics is like, your camera when you take a photo, except that it's a huge one. We have something like 50-meter length for a typical detector and many electronics readout channels, over 100 million electronic channels to read out, to take a picture of the interactions that happen between the two particles. And also the rate of the particles is very large. It's about 40 million per second. This is also the difference with the camera that we are using to take photos during your vacation. And the other sensitivity is also that we are sensitive to light, like a usual camera, but all other kinds of radiation. So when we have also the kind of detector, the size of the detectors that we use at the LHC, so I show you here two kinds of detectors, the CMS detector on the right, which is more compact for compact muon solenoid, and the Atlas detector, which is bigger on the left. So they are compared to the size of the Mount Rushmore in the US. So people who have visited Mount Rushmore, they know that the statues, are huge. You see the size of the trees on these figures. So this gives you a feeling how large these kind of detectors are at the LHC, and they correspond to many store buildings. Also, the weight of this detector, so if you were putting on a scale the CMS detector on the Eiffel Tower, in fact, the CMS detector is much heavier than the Eiffel Tower, by about 30%. So it's also extremely heavy and compact detector. So now let's discuss a bit how the detector is working in high energy or nuclear physics, because it's always the same. So this is illustrated on this kind of small sketch, which is here, where you have different particles you have that are emitted. So the point which is there corresponds at the interaction point, for instance, between two protons. The protons are destroyed, and we produce many particles inside the detector. So the first one that you see, for instance, you see this kind of red, orange color, or here a yellow color, and they correspond to what we call tracks. What is it? It is basically we have kind of a detector which can be made of wire or a gas, and when a charged particle crosses them, you can measure the points where the particles are entering. And before this, you can have even here a silicon detector, and this allows to measure the trajectory of the different charged particles and to reconstruct the points where they come from, so the point of interaction. So when we move to this kind of orange part, which is here, you see that some of the particles, for instance here the electron and here the photons, they are completely absorbed in this kind of detectors. Then if you go to the next one, which is the bigger, which here in blue, which is called hadronic calorimeter, the yellow one or orange one was the electromagnetic calorimeter, we see that the protons, the neutrons are absorbed in this detector. And this is related to the fact that in fact, depending on the kind of the particle, you need more or less matter to absorb them. So that's why the idea of this kind of detector is always the same. You have different layers of material in which the different particles can be absorbed. So this is the case of this particle that I showed you. And for instance, you see that to absorb these protons, also these neutrons, pions, and so on, you will need lots of material and in general, lots of steel. There are some particles which are even more evasive. You see here it's written muons. And these muons, they need lots of matter to be absorbed. That's why it's always the last particle to be detected outside the detector. And they need typically lots of absorber, lots of steel. There is a last one, which I didn't mention, which is here, which is the neutrino that you see in the dashed white line. And this particle is more difficult to detect because it crosses the detector without interacting. The probability, for instance, for one neutrino to cross the Earth, the full Earth, without interacting is very high. That's why our detector will surely not stop our neutrinos. That's why for this, the only way to identify them is by what we call missing energy. Because if there is no transverse energy when we did the collision, it means by conservation of energy, there should be no missing energy, or the balance of energy should be equal to 0. So if we see some missing energy, this will be the energy carried out by the neutrino, which was not detected. So this is always the same kind of ideas for the detector that we are using. So now let's come to the proton structure and what we are going to do to understand the proton using the kind of detectors I just described. So what we want to do, as I mentioned already at the beginning, is to understand what is the proton structure. As I told you already, so there is very simple kind of vision of proton with 2 quarks up and a quark down, which was maybe the vision of the proton more than 50 years ago. But the vision that I have is a more complicated one, which is a kind of soup of gluon and quarks. So, and the important point is that the structure of the proton, which is quite complicated, appears differently according to its energy, because it's a quantum object. That's why we define 2 variables that we call x and q squared. So q squared is the resolving power or the resolution power. It's like a microscope, basically. If you have an higher energetic accelerator, a bigger machine, or in other words, a bigger microscope, you can see more details inside the proton. So this is what is illustrated on this plot by showing how the vision of the proton, if you see, you could imagine it's a microscope that you look at the proton, varies when you increase the values of q squared or the resolution. The value of x is a bit different. This is the momentum fraction of the proton, which is possessed or carried by the quark or the gluon inside the proton. So you see when x decreases in this direction, it means that the number of these quark and gluons inside the proton increases. And this is illustrated again on this plot where you see a multi-gluon object as an example. So this is what we want to probe basically at a facility like the LHC. So before we go to the LHC, I will do a short insight because this was the kind of beginning of this story or this travel to understand the proton. And this was another accelerator that was called ERA. So this accelerator was an electron-proton collider. It was located in Hamburg, so in Germany. And there were 2 experiments called H1 and ZEUS, so as I said, electron-proton collider, with 20.7.5 GeV for the electron and 800 GeV and then 900 GeV for the protons. So, and I was myself member of the H1 collaboration. So why is an electron-proton collider ideal in order to understand the proton structure? So this is illustrated on this kind, again, of a schematic. I mean, just a scheme, it's not a quantum drawing. So you see, you have this electron, as I said, which is considered still today to be elementary. You have this big object, which is composite, this proton made of quark and gluons. And in most cases, the proton will be destroyed by the electron. You have a small electron that enters, that collides with high energy with this composite object, and it will destroy this composite object. So the electron and the way that it's scattered from the proton and the loss of its energy will be characteristic of the constituent of the protons. So it means what are the constituents in terms of quark and gluons inside the proton. So it means that measuring the properties of the outgoing electrons or the outgoing quark and gluon that we call jets, particle physics, will be characteristic of what happened during this collision. So this is the basic idea why the electron-proton collider is an ideal collider to study the proton structure. It's because it's the simplest possible. The electron is just scattered, it's not destroyed. So it's used simply as a probe of the proton structure. So this is an event, measured a real event that was taken by the H1 collaboration. So I just want to show how you can read this kind of events directly and see what happened during the collision. So the electrons were coming from the left, the protons from the right. They collided in the middle of the detector, which is here. You have this kind of energy which corresponds to the red points that goes what we call in the backward calorimeter that correspond to the scattered electron. And then you see some energy deposited, lots of energy, in the direction of the outgoing protons. So it means that in this case, the proton was destroyed. You see that we produced here, this is this kind of jets. You see that collimated energy that is produced in the detector that can be the sign of a quark, of a gluon that has been produced when the proton was destroyed. And you see also lots of energy, which is here in the forward calorimeter and the muon detector that correspond to the broken part, let's say, of the protons, what we call the proton remnants. So you see that basically on reading this kind of events, you can see what happened during the electron and the proton collision. So how are we going to interpret this? We take, again, the diagram that I showed you before in this resolving power and fraction of momentum, except now for this version, I reversed the position of q squared and x with respect to the previous diagram. And I want to show you to which domain we are sensitive, for instance, at ERA. So this was the experiment which are here in this area, if you see my cursor, which is before ERA. And the orange domain was the domain in q squared and x that was covered by HERA. So I did, in fact, my PhD at ERA myself, and this was the first measurement of the proton structure. And why was it so interesting? Is because, as you can see, we gained more than 2 orders of magnitude in X compared to the previous experiment and the newest experiment, which was basically at ERA. So it was a huge gain in kinetical domain. And for the first time, we could see the structure of the proton is this new completely domain. And we could discover that in this domain, the proton, is dominated by gluon. You can even forget almost about the quark in this new domain at small x, and it's a pure gluonic object. So this is just illustrated. So this is after 15 years of data, this kind of, gold plots coming from ERA, where you have the probability to find a parton or quark and gluon inside the proton, again, at this variable q squared, as I've been mentioning since 3 slides, which is the resolving power inside the proton. So what you notice, first of all, so this was the measurement on the left from the previous experiment, and the blue points correspond to the measurement from HERA. First, what is very striking is the number of data points and their precision. We reach better than 1% precision over the full range, which is really exceptional. And these points are compared, as you can see, with a full line for most of the points. And you can see that this full line describes very nicely all the points. And this corresponds to a description which is called quantum chromodynamics of the structure of the proton. Quantum chromodynamics is the theory which describes how the proton structure varies as a function of the resolving power coming from basic properties of quantum properties, let's say, quantum physics. So this is basically, we can see that the proton structure is well explained by the good description of quantum chromodynamics. And from this measurement, we can extract directly the content of the proton in terms of quark and gluons at different values of x and q squared using this quantum chromodynamic theory. So what about the LHC? So now let's move back to the LHC and discuss what we can say about the LHC. To the LHC, so we move from this orange domain, which was here at ERA, to this one, which is here, coming here. And also I show you the Tevatron, which was at Fermilab in the US, which is here, the blue and the green region for reference. So you see again that at the LHC, we gain a completely different domain, especially going to high values of the resolving power, and I will comment in a minute why it's interesting to go to high values of Q squared, to go to high mass. So this is an illustration, of the one of the CMS results, which shows again the measurement of the proton structure in proton-proton collision at the LHC. So this is similar to the one we showed at ERA. And again, compare with the same theory of quantum chromodynamics, you see that it leads again to a nice description of the data. And what does it mean? In fact, when you are at very large energy or at very large Q squared, you might have hoped to see some difference between this description of the data, which might have been a sign of a new object or a substructure of quarks, for instance. So it means that with present data at the LHC, so there were some new data, for instance, 13 TeV, in fact, we do not see any substructure for quarks up to now at the LHC, at the energy where we are. So this is quite an important result. Okay, so now let me discuss another domain. As I said, there is the other region, which is very low X. This is this one, the momentum of the parton or the quark or the gluon inside the proton, which is carried by the interacting object, so the momentum of the proton. And what we would like to see is something which is like the left sketch, which is here, which is the phenomenon of what we call saturation inside the proton or inside the heavy ion. So what is it? So this is, of course, this is a kind of situation. Like you can have people at peak hours when they take the metro, like in Paris or in New York. And of course, all these people in the metro are completely packed. The metro is completely full. So if something happens, hopefully it will not be the case, but to these people, if they are pushed, it means that these people will have a coherent behavior. If one of them, just at the beginning, here at the border, is pushed, all of them, they are so packed that it will influence all of them. And this is the same kind of behavior that we'd like to see inside the proton. There is this domain at very small x, where again, x is the momentum fraction of the proton, which is, for instance, carried by the interacting gluon. When x is very small, it means that the density of the gluon inside the proton is so large that they cannot longer be considered to be independent. So we have more a kind of coherent object. It also means that the usual equations that I told you of quantum chromodynamics are no longer valid, and it becomes more complicated. So this can be studied at the LHC and at the future ion collider in the US, as I will mention in a minute. And this will be really one of the breakthroughs in QCD if we had some evidence, clear evidence of saturation phenomena. So these slides will be a bit more technical because there was something which was proposed, for instance, to look at this in proton heavy ion collision at the LHC as an example. And these are illustrated in these small drawings which are here, which basically shows an interaction between a proton and the ion and two gluons or quarks, what we call jets, that are produced in the main detector. In this case, the two jets are produced in the central part of the detector. You have X, which can be smaller than 1, but not very smaller than 1. So this is definitely not a good configuration in order to look for low X events. Then you can have one jet here in the very forward region and one in the central region. In that case, X of the proton of the other one and X for the heavy ion is smaller than 1, but not much smaller than 1. So this is also not good. So the configuration we have to study is this one. When the two jets go in the very forward direction, this is the outgoing ions, which is here, a direction of the outgoing proton, and the incoming ions. And in this case, you have X of the proton, which is close to 1, and X of the heavy ion, which is much smaller than 1. So this is definitely this kind of events that we would like to analyze in order to access the very low X domain of the heavy ions, where we can hope to see some saturation phenomena. So this is illustrated on this plot. So again, it's a bit complicated one, but I wanted to show it to you, which it represents what is the suppression factor between proton-proton and proton-heavy-ion interactions if we can measure these very forward jets, if saturation is expected. If there is no saturation, you would expect this ratio to be of the order 1. So you see what we expect given the gluon density inside the V-ion, like lead, for instance, which is a heavy object, and we have some proton-lead collision at the LHC. You see that the effects as a function of large azimuthal angle difference between the two jets in the final state can be an effect of 70% of the cross-section. So this is one of the measurements that we will discuss during our workshop and the feasibility studies to do it inside CMS, for instance, at the LHC, by measuring jets in the very forward direction inside a special detector that was installed, which is called CASTOR. Then, to study also this topic, and that's why we wanted to have this workshop also related to the electron-ion collider. As I mentioned before, to study the proton structure, ERA, which was electron-proton collider, was the ideal accelerator. And this is the same if you want to understand the lead object, which is much heavier, as I said, and where you hope to see saturation effects. You use the electron as a probe in order to understand better the heavy ion. That's why the electron-ion collider is ideal to see saturation. In a word, as I said, the electron is used as a probe, and the heavy ion has a higher value of what we call a saturation scale, since it's proportional to the power 1/3. So now the decision was to build such a collider in the US at the Brookhaven National Lab. So the decision was taken at the end of last year. So of course it will take a bit of time to build it and so on, probably in the next 10 or 15 years. But at least the detector design studies and the experimental collaboration will be built next year. And also I should mention that there is a global effort to make a plan for high energy physics in future, which is in progress via the SNOMAS effort. So I put the webpage here if people are interested. And together with Pavel Nadolsky and Yue Wayne Lin, we are conveners of the QCD and strong interaction and for the hadronic structure and forward QCD working group. So if people are interested, they are very much it would be nice if they could contact us, and they are very much welcome to join this kind of effort. Okay, so now this is a kind of transition to another topic that I want to discuss, which are these famous diffractive events, which I call strange events. So what was noticed? So this is, for instance, an LHC event, but it was even noticed before at ERA or Tevatron or even at CERN and the UA experiment. So there are some cases in which you have a proton-proton interactions, but the proton is not destroyed, is intact in the final state. I put here, like an everyday analogy, it's as if there was an accident between two big trucks, like the two protons, and in the final state, after the accidents, the two big trucks can be intact, plus you produce some small cars because you have some objects that are produced in the detector. So this is really what would happen in today's life, which is of course impossible, but this is what we see in everyday collision. And I should say that the probability to get one proton intact in this kind of collision, the order of magnitude is about 1%. So it's not negligible at the LHC. So just to show you again one event from ERA, because it's always easier to see them because it's electron-proton interaction. So this is the kind of event that we discussed so far, where you have the electron scattered in the backward calorimeter, you have some jets that are produced, you have the protons that are completely destroyed, and then at ERA it was about 10% of the event. It looks like this. Some event looks like this. Again, you have the electron, which is here in the backward calorimeter, some quarks and gluons that were produced and detected in the liquid argon calorimeter in blue. And you see that in the forward part is completely empty. So you don't see the proton remnants. So why is it like this? And I must say it was quite a surprise to see this at ERA, is that in most of the cases, the protons are intact in the final state. And as we will see in a minute, this is quite also important to measure at the LHC. So this is in Atlas, but the same in CMS. So there was some detectors that were installed about 200 meters from the collision point of Atlas or CMS in order to detect and measure this intact proton in the final state. So we will discuss one of the topics. So there is another topics which I will not discuss here, which to understand, the QCD aspects of these events, which we will discuss during our workshop, because of the lack of time, I will skip this part, but I will discuss another topic related to diffraction and photon events. So what I want to discuss, first of all, is that it's a view in the tunnel. So this is the CMS part. And this is always the same idea. To measure this kind of events, we use what we call Raman pots. So what is a Raman pot? And why do we call it a Raman pot? Raman is because the first people who invented these detectors are people from Rome. It was there at CERN. And the pot, because it looks like a pot. You might see it in the tunnel. It's like a big pot. So the idea of these detectors is to measure the protons that are scattered at very small angles. So when the beam is not stable, or when you are injecting the beam, you put them far away from the beam so that they cannot be damaged. And when the beam is stable, you move them, let's say 10 sigma, 15 sigma, depending on the experiment, from the beam in order to measure the scattered protons at very small angles. So you have the schematic, which is here along a CMS. So it's on both sides of CMS, where you have the detectors, which were from the TOTEM experiment, that measure the protons that are scattered after collision in CMS. So what we are going to discuss also is what is the acceptance for this kind of detectors. And I have said, so there is the QCD part, which is here, where you have how to have proton intact in the final state, is by having colorless exchanges. So colorless exchanging, it means, for instance, from a QCD point of view, you need to exchange at least 2 gluons, and in this event, you produce 2 jets. Or the way to have a colorless exchange, so this is, again, a Feynman diagram. So this corresponds to the proton before the collision and the intact proton after the collisions. The protons emit a quasi-real photon that interact to produce an object that can be detected in the detector. So this is an object. Another way to have a colorless exchange is by using photons. So for the standard running at the LHC, the acceptance of our forward detectors in mass of this object which has been produced, so either the 2 jets which are here or this object which is here, is between, let's say, 500 GeV and goes above 2 TeV. And this is quite important because, in fact, it shows that we are sensitive to high mass production at the LHC. So why is it interesting to look like this? It's because we can look to, especially in a new method, to look for extra dimension in the universe. As you know, we live in a 4-dimensional space. Like we have a 3 dimension of space and 1 dimension of time. And gravity might live in extra dimension. And this is why we wanted to explore this at the LHC, looking for new couplings between particles and production of new particles. And of course, if this is discovered at the LHC, this may lead to major changes in the way we see the world or the universe. So the way we study this in our example, by tagging the 2 intact protons in the final state and measuring 2 photons in the final state. So you see that these events are extremely clean because you produce 2 photons and 2 protons and nothing else. And the way the photon interact is sensitive to extra dimension. So this is the way that we can get sensitivity to this extra dimension of the universe, or to additional model, for instance, composite Higgs or axion particle, as you will mention in a few minutes. So in addition to gamma-gamma, we are also looking at another channel where we can produce some W boson or Z boson. It's a bit technical. They were discovered at CERN in the 90s, or a dead boson plus a photon. So what are the motivations, again, to look for this kind of events, what we call quartic photon-photon anomalous coupling, because you see that we have 2 photons and 2 photons in the final state, so you have 4 photons. That's why we call it quartic photon coupling. In fact, in a technical way, the coupling between these 4 photons can be introduced in a model-independent way by loops of new particles. So this is on this diagram. You see that the photon can couple to new particles and they can be produced in loop. And in that case, the coupling is proportional to the force power of the energy. So this is here, the Q, the charge of the particle, then divided by the force power of the mass of the particle and proportional to the spin of the particle. And typically, you can get some new coupling of the order of 10 to minus 14, 10 to minus 13. So very low values of the coupling that are predicted by some extra dimension kind of models. Then there is another way to modify also this coupling is by producing some resonances, as it is shown here on the right plot. In that case, the coupling is proportional to the power -2 of the coupling gamma gamma to resonance, gamma gamma to X, the mass power again -2, and again proportional to the spin. So typical beyond standard models would predict a coupling of the order of 10 to minus 13. So now we need to see if we are sensitive at the LHC to this kind of values by measuring the proton in the final state. And I will do a small aside before going to the dependence, which is illustrating what is pileup at the LHC, because this is our leading background. In fact, you should not see the LHC as a collider that collides one proton against another proton, but it collides packets of protons. So there is a high number of collisions that occurs within the same Birch crossing, and it's illustrated on these two schematics which are here. So you have here the two protons that collide. My two protons emit my two photons, that they're intact in the final state. So definitely, we want to keep this kind of events. And each star corresponds to a different interaction. But we would like to reject this kind of events, where you have, again, the two protons are intact, the two photons are here, but they originate from different interactions, or from different proton-proton interactions. And I showed you here only 6 interactions. There are just only 6 stars, but you should imagine that there are about 50 of such collisions within the same collision at the LHC. So this is definitely this background that we need to reject, because my two photons have nothing to do with my two protons. And this is where measuring the protons and the photons, or basically all the particles that are produced in the final state, is the key point. Why is it like this? It's because, in fact, as I told you already, in these very simple kinematics, the simple events, we have one proton, two protons, one photon, two photons that are produced and nothing else. And we measure both the protons, this dedicated detector, and the photons in CMS or Atlas. It means that basically, by kinematical conservation, the information from the protons and the information from the photons should be the same. For instance, we can measure the mass of the two photons inside CMS and the mass of the two protons inside Totem and compare them. And this is illustrated on the two plots, which show the mass ratio, which is here. So this is our signal here in black for these exclusive events. And here in red, you have for the pileup events. Let me come back 1 second for the pileup events. Since you know that the two photons have nothing to do with my two protons, of course, the mass of the two photons is not related to the mass of the two protons for my pileup events. So that's why the red curve is almost flat, correspond to the background. And this is the same for the difference in rapidity. Rapidity is related, let's say, to the angle distribution of the detector between the two photons and the two protons. So this is an extremely powerful way to get rid of the background by measuring the two protons and the two photons. And in fact, after cutting on these two variables, we get a zero background for even high luminosity at the LHC, which means that any observation of one event like this would be a discovery. So this is a fundamental way, and this is being performed now at the LHC. So just I want to show you the events. So this is technical, but I just want to show you these are the coupling that we reach, and we reach indeed the couplings that are predicted by this extra dimension or composite Higgs model. So we'll be able to probe this kind of model using 300 inverse femtobarn of data at the LHC, and even at high luminosity, 3000 inverse femtobarn with 200 of pileup events. So now we have already 100 inverse femtobarn, which has been collected by the experiments by the CMS experiment before the shutdown, and is being analyzed. And after the shutdown, both Atlas and CMS will restart taking this data, motivated by this study that we performed. So generalize it, we can look also for action-like particles. They can produce in the same way, gamma-gamma going to action and it can be detected in the decay by 2 photons. So this is the situation that we have with a coupling versus mass of this action before our proposal, so let's say, and you see that the low mass region is well covered, but the high mass region is rather poorly covered. And what we had, our method, we gain also to about 2 orders of magnitude on the coupling for the action, and we access a completely new domain of high mass for action-like particle. And also, I should say that there is complementarity with lead-lead running at the LHC, because lead-lead running can allow to access lower masses. In the last part of the talk, in the last 10 minutes or so, I would like to discuss a bit detectors. The detector that we developed, in many LHC experiments, and also in Kansas, is what we call to measure the proton time of flight. Because another method, so for instance, what I said is 2 photon events, another method to reject this pileup event is to measure the time of flight of the protons. Because if we measure the time of flight of the proton, imagine that you have a detector here, of course you know the distance, you know where the position of the interaction, so you know the distance, you know that the proton, they go at the speed of light. So if you measure the time of the protons, you will know if they originate from the same vertex as my 2 photons, or from a pileup vertex. So you would tell me, yeah, but anyway, we don't need it, because for the 2 photons, you told us that without this, you have already 0 background. So why having, in addition, time of flight detector? It's in fact, I didn't mention it, but we want to do also the production of 2 W in the same photon interaction. And the W can decay into lepton, so electron muon or tau, and neutrino. As I mentioned at the beginning, we cannot measure the neutrino. So in that case, the technique that I showed you for the 2 photons will not be possible, because I will not be able to measure the mass of the 2 Ws in CMS or Atlas because of the escaping neutrinos. So this is where measuring the time of the proton, time of flight of the proton, is crucial. So what do we want to have? This is a schematic. So what we want to have is a kind of detectors that will cross, the proton will cross it, and we will measure the signal coming out from the crossing protons. You want to get 10 or 20 picosecond final precision, which is a huge factor of, a huge precision on time measurement. We want to get a very good efficiency, high rate capability to follow the rate of the LHC, segmentation in case of multi-proton timing, and also, if possible, to be able to use a trigger. So there are different detectors that were proposed: quartz, diamond, gas, or silicon. And in Kansas or in Totem, we concentrated on the quartz and the fast silicon detectors. So how does it work? It's always the same idea. So let's assume that you have, for instance, the silicon detector. A proton is going through the detector, and you measure the signal that will be produced by the proton going, for instance, through the silicon detector. And we can measure the signal if you have a very good oscilloscope using an oscilloscope, or some electronics, and we want, of course, some electronics in order to measure the signal. So on this slide, we basically describe the method that we use to analyze the signal. So the first diagram shows you the signal that comes directly from the diamond or from the silicon detector. You see that it's a very small signal, of course. That's why the first step is to amplify that signal. You see it on the second small diagram, without modifying the good characteristic of that signal. For instance, what I'm thinking is about the rise time or this kind of good properties, not adding noise to that signal. And this is what we built at the University of Kansas. So we basically built a patent also to get an amplifier that allows to amplify a signal from silicon or a diamond detector, so very small signal, without distorting it, and also for a low price. I mean, our amplifier costs something like a few tens of dollars per channel, whereas there are commercial ones which are not that good, but they are most of the order of $1,000 per channel. Then the next step is shown by the third sketch, which you have here, is to measure the signal directly. And for this, what we are doing is perform a fast digitization of the signal. So you see, for instance, on this schematic, this is the part of the signal that is decreasing. So for instance, you can take 64 data points. You make linear interpolation between these data points that allow to reconstruct very precisely this part of the signal. So this has two consequences. The first consequence is that by reconstructing this part of the signal, you can get a very precise timestamp when the signal arrived or when the particle entered the detector. So this is the way that we can measure very precisely time of flight, and also the shape of the signal and also the depth of the signal is characteristic of the kind of particle and the energy. So it's not really for this application in high energy physics where we just want to measure the time of flight, but as we will see in the following, this is quite fundamental for other applications where we want to have particle ID and particle energy measurement using this kind of detectors. We will see, for instance, and we'll discuss medical applications and also application with NASA in order to measure cosmic rays. Because we want, the best detector possible, obviously. So this is this simple theorem, which is illustrated here. In order to get a good signal, you need a large Q, which means lots of charge. You need a large V, which is a large velocity inside your detector. So when you talk about velocity, this is the electron and ion moving in your detector. And you need as large field as possible in your detector. So this, in fact, that's why we use this kind of detectors, because they have all these kind of good properties. And indeed, we developed, as I said, the readout board followed by the amplifier in order to test all these kind of detectors for nuclear physics or also for different applications. So the advantage is that this kind of board that we design is very cheap. We are talking about a few tens of dollars per channel, because there are also some commercial version of it, but we are more talking about thousands of dollars per channel. So that's why we needed to develop something which is much cheaper. So we did also preliminary time measurement, which are being performed at the lab, a new lab we have at the university. So we use either a laser in order to light the silicon detector, which we show here on this figure, and then we can measure it either using software or directly the oscilloscope, or we can use also a radioactive source in order to do the measurement. In addition to this, we can test our detector at Fermilab. So these are the result of two tests, that I wanted to show you. So this is a lab using a laser where you see basically the size of the pixel. You see that the signal is 0, it's before the silicon pixel. You see that the efficiency increased very rapidly to reach very fast 100% and then decreases at the end of the pixel. And this is the time resolution that we get with a single silicon detector, which of the order of 40 picoseconds, so at the time of this beam test at Fermilab. And until then, we even reach something better of the order of 30 picoseconds per channel, which means that the goal to have 10 to 20 picoseconds is possible if you have a few layers of this detector. So on this slide, we show one of the application that we are doing using this timing detector. We call timing detectors, but again, this is with a different application related to space physics. What we would like to do is to measure the type of particles that are emitted in cosmic rays and also identify them. For instance, you want to know if it's a proton, if it's a light ion like helium, an alpha particle, or if it's a heavy ion like, for instance, lead, gold, And so you want at the same time to have in a compact detector, typically this is in a CubeSat, allowing you to identify the particle and measure their energy. So the way we do this is to have different layers of silicon detector, as we mentioned before, and measure the spectrum of the signal in each different layer. So this method allows you to identify and measure the energy of the particle precisely directly in space. And this is what we are doing in collaboration with NASA. We're now using the same techniques to measure, for instance, the effect of catalysis in chemistry. So just an illustration here. If you have an interface between, for instance, gas or two liquids and water, as an example, using interferometry technique, the laser checking how the interface varies as a function of time, and taking a snapshot every 50 picoseconds will allow us to understand better the interaction between the two, or understand better catalysis in chemistry, with some applications, for instance, desalinization of seawater, or also to improve medicine performance. Another application which exists in many also area related to medicine, the time of flight idea, is in PET tomography. I mean, usually when people can have a cancer, I mean, they ingest some radioactive elements that will interact, they emit positron. The positron interact with the electron of the human body and emit two photons. And the two photons are detected inside these PET detectors. And from the detection of the two photons, you can reconstruct the image originating from the objects that emitted these two photons. So it means that this is particularly good to do an image of a tumor. But the problem is that the human body emits lots of photons, and typically only one pair of photons out of 10,000 will be a good one related to this tumor. But if you measure the time of flight of these two photons with high precision, you can request them to originate from the tumor region, because you know, of course, where is the tumor roughly inside the human body. So you can suppress many of these fake photons and obtain online imaging. So this is, I mean, developed in many institutes. So we have some collaboration also with the medical university, so in Missouri or in Kansas, and also with people in Dublin. So as I said, so many applications, PET imaging, and also the idea is to measure the doses when people are treated for cancer, for instance, and this we can get a much better measurement and increase especially the space resolution for these measurements when people are treated for cancer, and such reduce the dose by getting a measurement with a millimeter square precision. So now let me conclude. I mean, I think we discussed a lot about the structure of the proton. So we showed that there are many new recent results in the past years, and it led to a better understanding of the proton structure in terms of quark and gluons. So this is quite fundamental to understand the structure of the proton, especially at LHC energies. There is no sign so far of a substructure of quarks, for instance. The saturation effects, and there is already some sign, but not some clear evidence or discovery of this kind of effects. So we have some idea to explore it further at the LHC. I described a couple of measurements, for instance, compare proton-heavy ion and proton-proton collision in the very forward direction. And also, we have some measurement at the EIC. Also, we described some application using the events with intact protons, which is interesting for QCD, and also exploratory physics, like extra dimension, composite Higgs, or also people think about the axion lag particle as an example. There are also the timing detectors, and we will discuss this during our workshop between June 28 and July 2.